Hello and welcome again to the Imagination Podcast. This is sponsored by the PhD and THD programs at Kairos University. I'm your host, Tony Blair, and we've been talking for the past 3 or 4 months now about the topic of imagination. In fact, we've been talking particularly with people who help us to reimagine, to question why we do things the way we do, and maybe there's another way to do this. And today's guest on our podcast is passionate about the why. And he's applied this kind of curiosity in a variety of roles and contexts. The reason we know each other is because of his leadership role at Kairos University. There are folks out here who are listening to this who are not part of Kairos University. So I'll introduce you a little bit more fully here. I invite you to do the same. Nate Helling serves as Executive Vice President and our Chief Financial Officer. He's also on the Board of Commissioners for the Association of Theological Schools, which is our specialized accreditor. So Nate knows his industry, he knows our institution, he knows our values, and he's one of the primary folks that is helping to instill them. And so I had originally invited him. I've just enjoyed over the past few years getting to know Nate, and particularly not just his mind, but his spirit. And I originally made him come on and talk about the reimagining financial stewardship. And it was Nate who suggested, well, maybe we can go a little broader than that. We might talk about that, but maybe we can go something more foundational. Why do we start with why? Which I think is one of the best questions that a leader can ever ask. And we're going to do that. So first, I'm going to ask you two questions at once, Nate. First, would you please give us maybe a little fuller introduction of some of the roles and contexts in which you have served and led beyond Kairos, context that I don't know as much. But then let's move into the question. Why start with why?
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Tony, for doing this work on this podcast. It's been fun to follow along, and I just enjoy the fact that we get to have these conversations both on camera and off camera pretty often, and so appreciate you and what you're doing. Maybe I'll start this way. We were just talking a little bit about why or improvement or better. And my wife will jokingly say to me, she's like, you've never seen anything that can't be a little better, right? Is this constant improvement? And then she'll follow it up and say, sometimes things are just okay the way they are. But I'm not wired that way. I've always been wired to kind of see everything through a lens of curiosity, of kind of how does that work? Why does it work that way? And, how might we do it better? What are we actually trying to do? I may have been born that way. It certainly formed that way through a long list of mentors. I think Tony, I mentioned to you, like, it's not surprising. I've come from a mechanical engineer who's also pretty creative, and a psychology major who became an accountant. Like, those are my parents. And so it's this sort of combination of what you see here today. But my journey through higher education. So I've been at one school, one university for 25 years, but lots of different careers at this one school. And so I started in 2004 and primarily was major gifts. And so I was traveling all over the US and Canada, talking to people about money, about generosity, and so on. I can promise you I wasn't prepared. I didn't have a lot of training at that time. I had to go learn kind of how to have those crucial conversations, and a lot of mentors sort of helped shape me in that work as well. I did that primarily for 6 years, and then through some transition at our school, I moved into leadership in enrollment and financial aid while still doing the fundraising work. So I kept about 100 relationships in the fundraising work, but then also started working with our enrollment team, our financial aid team, and so on. I did that and I think I should take a step back. I also did a Master of Divinity while
I was going to call attention to that because
yeah.
there's a theological dimension to what you're exploring here. Lovely.
Yeah. And so along the way, along with my that formal learning, informal learning, but I was doing a Master of Divinity at our school. I started in an MBA program, and so I was working on an MBA, and then I came to work at the seminary. And honestly, I was a little not impressed with. I had a really good business undergraduate, and so some of what I was doing in my MBA felt a little bit repetitive. And I also was leading some young professional ministry in the church and so on, and wanted to kind of go in that direction too. So I kind of designed my own Master of Divinity at Sioux Falls Seminary. Kind of worked alongside our faculty and so on to do that. But so I was working on my MDiv
I
at the
might
same.
interrupt for a moment
Go
just
ahead.
for a quick commercial because I'm rather excited about this. Within the last few months, we now have a relationship with a partner at Kairos that where students can do the MBA and incorporate it, a accredited MBA, and incorporate it into an MDiv at Kairos and bring those two pieces together a bit more formally. And
Yeah.
so anyway, if somebody of anybody that's interested, we can make that kind of connection work these days.
Yeah, I am also excited. That is what I was looking for. So when I started that process, I really would have loved to find that, and it did exist, but not there were not very many of them, and it just there the opportunities for me to participate, just where life and family and everything else at the time wasn't going to work, and so I built my own. But yeah, so we'd love to talk more about that partnership, and are open to others similarly in that sphere. But
It's part of this reimagining. Yeah.
Mhm.
Why should these things be separate fields and why can't they be integrated? And anyway, I interrupted you, Nate,
No,
twice
no,
now.
no, yeah, you please do, because otherwise I'll keep talking on and on. But yeah, so did the enrollment financial aid work, and then at about 2012, I stepped into it wasn't the CFO title at the time, but it was pretty much that role that has more to do with kind of where we were organizationally at the time than anything else. Some who hear this will know, and others won't. But in 2012, we had about 6 months to a year to live, and it was a kind of a moment in our organizational history where we needed to do something extremely different, or we needed to prepare to close. And those were our options. We had a fair bit of debt. Our operating model wasn't working, and so on. And so when I stepped into the financial role, it was into that setting, and kind of an opportunity to work with our president at the time, our board, and others to, yeah, in some ways say, I think we could try some things. Certainly we can close, but I think there are opportunities to, again, reimagine the work that we're doing, and yeah, and try some things. So in my own personal story,
You guys
go ahead.
did that brilliantly. So I want to tell part of the story that Nate probably won't tell because they ended up hiring a leader who's got this gift of imagination. And those of you who listen to the podcast have heard Greg Henson come in and talk about this. But it was Nate and a couple of others who were able to imagine first what could be, and then imagine what kind of leadership might be necessary to make that happen. And you guys were the ones who initiated this process and kind of recruited him and made it happen. It started with you.
Not just me, but certainly started with a group that had been here, and had been formed towards thinking in these ways. And again, part of my personal story is I was preparing to leave at that point. And so I'd kind of I'd come to the point in my journey where I had a lot of frustration, and primarily around sort of the inability to ask why questions. And so again, I'd like to ask why all the time, like to fully understand something, or to see what we might be able to do in that. But I felt like our structures, both at our school, but also broadly in the academy, in many ways prevented some of the why questions, or responded to them in ways that didn't feel very generous. And so when we were looking for a new president, I was prayerfully contemplating what else I might go do. What was God calling me to do next? And thankfully, at the same time, I was also one of the people who was recommending Greg Henson, who was our president. It's like, here's one of the people who that we should be paying attention to, somebody I had interacted with and had a similar role than that I did at another seminary. And so Greg becoming our president meant I was sticking around and re-energized to, again, reimagine together. But if Greg wasn't, I don't know what I'd be doing today.
That's awesome. I had, by the way, a very early experience, probably around the same time that you guys are doing this with Greg as well, because I was a seminary president. And one of the things I was trying to do was reimagine the role between fundraising and admissions. And
Mhm.
how do we nurture relationships with those who want to support us with don't support us with their financial sources? How do we want to imagine the relationship we have with those who would trust us with their learning? And I didn't think they were necessarily two separate things. And there was a way we could do it. And I ended up talking to a colleague at ATS who said, "Hey, there's this guy named Greg Henson who's reimagined how to do that. Maybe you ought to chat with him." And I had that conversation probably about the time that you were connecting with him as well. And look how God over time pulled all those pieces together.
Yeah. Most seminaries in the US and Canada are more like a small business and a cottage industry, yet the layers that we build and the silos that we design within our organizational systems complicate things in ways that are unnecessary. I would say it's kind of surprising. It's not surprising, right? You get a bunch of academics and smart people in a room, and we do make complex things. That's kind of in our nature. And so part of what we have to do, and this comes back to like what we did organizationally, was like take a step back. How do you simplify, the questions? How do you, um, yeah, take a
Yeah.
deeper look at the way we've been trying to do this work and understand it actually doesn't have to be this way. And again, development work and admissions is one great example of it's the same thing. It gets the same work, right? It's walking with somebody through a discipleship conversation about something that's core to who they are, right? Whether it's the next step in their own learning journey or whether it's generosity. But you might say the same thing about a number of the relational aspects of the work that we do. And so we don't have to put them in separate buckets. We can it's just
And
talk.
the way we structure ourselves, when I became a seminary president, I had an institution that up to about a year before it had a president and four vice presidents and a whole
Yeah.
variety of offices. We had a total of 150 students.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I had been dean of a college within a university, and that college had 2,000 students. And a program could have 150, and we didn't need to have an administration of 20 people to support it. So we started saying, "What are we assuming here about what is necessary?" And maybe there's another way to go about this.
Yeah, we had a similar, I started in a similar environment, 20 people and like seven employment layers, right? Like really, I mean, we can all get in a room and have this conversation, but it felt like what you were supposed to do. Like it's how we were, it's how schools were supposed to be designed. It's how we read the accreditation things. It's how we did all of those things. And so,
But
um,
why don't we do the why? Is it laziness? Is it inertia? Is it because we're not wired to think wise? Why is this so rare that we would take a look at that and say, hold it here a minute. Maybe we need to back up and just re-examine, start from scratch and re-examine what we're doing here.
yeah. I think most of us think we start with why, and when we talk
Mm,
about starting with why, I mean Tony and I, Simon Sinek is an author that both of us have read, or
mm,
he's got a great podcast even today that I listen to um, every time it comes out. But I think most organizations, seminaries included, churches, others, we think we know what our why is, right? And it makes its way into a mission statement or something, but they're usually so generalized, it's hard to actually and yeah, figure out what makes my why different than your why, right? And so if we were to take all the church mission statements in, whatever city we live in and put them on a list, most of us would be have a hard time figuring out which one goes where, and maybe even our own. It's
mm.
and so
I've taught this to students many times and consulted with organizations. If your mission statement doesn't differ from the church down the road, or even the business, if it doesn't look different in the business down the road who's selling the same things, then there's no reason for you to exist separately. Join
mhm.
forces with the people who are apparently doing the exact same thing you're doing.
Yeah.
But if there is a clear distinction, if there's a clear identity, a clear calling, even,
Mhm.
then that would motivate the why. Why not articulate that? Why not be upfront about that?
Yeah, so organizationally, and this is common. I mean, that's why there are books written about it, but we're not good at that. And then we jump very quickly to the how. So we start with this very broad, general, directional statement, and then we spend all of our time thinking about the how, and that's where you get these complex systems in the academy. In terms because all of our time is we're talking about things like shared governance, or we're talking about things like student faculty interact. Like we're just all the hows we get tied up in, and we just sort of lose the most important piece of the conversation, which is that why.
Does it necessarily, going back to that, take us in a different direction? or can we end up doing what we're currently doing, but perhaps with just a little more passion for it because we have a little deeper why residing inside of us?
Yeah. And so, I mean, so those of us that follow Jesus, right? So we come at this work knowing that it's not just our work, right? That we're part of something bigger. And so, if you interact with me much, you will eventually hear me say something along the lines. This is my kind of my stewardship theology of that God has given us everything we need to do whatever it is God's calling us to do. And so,
That was
stewardship,
exactly why I originally invited you to come on to
yeah,
say that and explain that. But go
yeah,
on. Yeah.
yeah. Because so stewardship is about what we have, not what we want or think we need. And so again, the number of schools and organizations I work with that spend all their time saying, "What if I only had, right? If I just need more money, or if I only had more people, or we had more students, or so on," rather than taking a deep breath and saying, "All right, like what have we been given to do this work, and are our goals sort of aligning with what we've been given?" And then pretty quickly, I'll also say things like, and this gets into the collaborative spirit that we have here, that we often only look at our own bank accounts and our own payroll when we talk about what we've been given as organizations. So back to like if our mission statement's the same and the missions of the church down the road, maybe God has given us that church too to be a part of what we're to be doing together. And so our primary work then is to discern first what God is doing, both individually, like God, how has God created me and brought me to this specific work, but then pretty quickly the community, right? So what are we what are we supposed to be about, and what has God given us, and are those things matching? And that's most of the work right there.
So, what has God called us to do ourselves, and what has God called us to do together
Hmm.
with others become part of the same coin there? Then, here's one of my favorite phrases, and my staff at my the church that I help to lead probably tired of me saying this one to them, but the greatest hindrance to the best is the good.
Mm.
So, particularly Christian organizations, we get enamored by the good. Choosing between, to this is my argument, choosing between good and bad is easy. We don't always do it, but that's an
Mhm.
easy decision to see in most cases. This is bad, this is good. Choosing between best and good is much, much harder. So, hey, this looks like a good idea. Okay, let's do it. But is it ours to do? Is it the best thing for us to direct the limited? And we all have limited energy resources, people, money, all that stuff. We all have limited stuff to that we can do. So why don't we focus on what is our best thing to do, and
Yeah.
allow other people to do good things that are not ours?
Yeah, yeah, I like that. The one thing I might kind of tweak in that, if you allow, right, is to make sure that we don't let that kind of thinking or that decision mean we don't do anything. And
Well,
so that we can get paralyzed in the what is the best next step, and I can fall into this myself where sometimes we're just called to make the next good step towards it, or that again it's the all of this, all innovation, all reimagining, everything is done in an iterative way, right? You don't just wake up tomorrow with an iPhone, right? Like there are decades of people dreaming and thinking and designing, and all of a sudden I have this thing that feels magical in my hand. It didn't just appear, right? It's kind of this long walk towards a direction and discerning along the way. It's how we find our ways to kind of reimagining or this innovation, but letting that letting the spirit and that kind of that wide discernment kind of steer us. But yeah, but I see a lot of organizations that don't, well, because we're not sure between what is the best step. We don't take any steps. We just
mhm.
kind of stay where we are. And yeah, that can be a problem too.
Yeah, maybe both ends of it. We get our fingers out in so many different things that we don't do anything well in the end, or we don't know what it is that's so distinctive, or we don't act, and then inertia will take over. Higher education has befuddled me a little bit because we do teach this stuff, and yet we are among the most conservative enterprises in the world. And
Yeah.
we still have faculty dressing up in 800-year-old robes, not the individual robes, but the 800-year-old process of wearing our robes and processing in and existing in a hostile competitive relationship with administrators who are
Mhm.
trying to persuade board members to do what they want to do and sometimes getting denied. And we end up with a culture that is very seldom healthy in my own
Yeah.
opinion.
And I think importantly, right, you don't have to leave everything behind to reimagine, right? So who you are is part of that story, but sometimes we do get caught a little bit too much in what was. I mean, in the industry, we celebrate when, right, when a company closes and a new one emerges, right? Or when a company reimagines itself, right? Like this is for those of us, Tony, you and I both have training and more secular business leadership training, and we've all read the books, and just in terms of how you kind of reimagine and you build on that sort of stuff. But for some reason in the church, and certainly in the academy, even in some of the nonprofit spheres, we struggle. We struggle with that. We use language like institution, which I would like to stop using, right? Because it says that we're intended to be here forever. And as soon as you have that mindset, it's really easy to fall back into my job is to make sure that the institution is here forever versus the why or the mission is fulfilled. And so, yeah, we have some work to do in that area.
So, how else does this impact? Let's talk about financial stewardship for just a moment here. You gave us the core principle, and I hear you say this all the time within our own institution. I heard you say it, I think, the first time we met, and I had never heard anybody articulate that quite that clearly. What does that look like on the ground floor when you say, hey, hey, we we're going to steward well what's been given to us, and yet there are commitments that
Mhm.
have been made, and there are things that seem to be part of our why that need to be done. How do you handle that tension?
Yeah. Well, it's helpful. I don't recommend it in every instance, but it's helpful to start some of those conversations from a place of there is no, no extra money or there is no money. And so when I while I was spent time sort of bringing in revenue through enrollment and fundraising, I wasn't actively involved in money the spending decisions or the spending plan or so on. So when I stepped into that role, it was clear to me we didn't have any money to spend. Like every dollar we were spending was a dollar we did not have, and there's stress for anybody who's wondered if payroll is going to happen this month. You understand the stress and the burden that is, but along with that, the opportunity to again uh, ask a why question for every dollar you spend is a so I did that early on. We were a $3.5 million annual operation, and I spent a pretty significant amount of time and looked at every dollar we had spent over the last 5 and 10 years. And again, through the questioning of like, okay, why? Why did we spend that? Why did we choose to do that? Why, did that actually do what we had hoped it would do? Trying not to simply start with a what are we going to cut, but start with a like if we were going to rebuild, how would we rebuild? And for me, that gave me a pretty strong understanding of kind of where we were, kind of what we were spending, and so on. But it also gave me a platform to start talking to our community about something else I say often, which is how do you steward every dollar well, right? So how do when we make a spending decision, which in many cases is the only thing we can control operationally, like financially as an organization. We can do faithful activity that might lead to students or might lead to a gift or something else, but most of that is out of our control. What we can control is what we spend and
I
how
made
we
up a number. I made up a number once to talk about that. My argument
spend.
is if they're 15 to 20% of our circumstances or environment we can control. I totally made it up. I don't have data, but I found it to be roughly true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So this goes back to a few statements early on where we just said, we're not going to spend money we don't have anymore. Right. So like that was a community, and it wasn't just me standing in for a board or somebody saying it was our community saying like we can't stay here, right? This doesn't work, and so let's be committed to not spending more than we've been given. And that was we're 12 years into that, and we haven't done that really since that point, and that led to some very hard decisions, things we had to think about. And if you work in our world, most of that is people, and so 85% of the spending that Kairos University spends on today is towards a person. And that's a little bit different for every school, but and so every decision we make pretty much at this point has to do with a person. And so how do you how do you think about spending in that way? But then also, another conversation that we had, and this one continued as Greg became our president, and we kind of really got going. But what we've been given isn't just dollars and cents, right? It is people. It is other resources and so on. And so one of the more profound kind of things that we did, and I've done this now with other schools, is we started with some questions like, okay, if we had to rebuild our school today with 5 people, who would they be? And leave all the titles and the degrees and everything aside. Like what kind of person is that? Who would they be? What would and as an example, one of the people on our list was always one of our board members, right? He wasn't actually an employee, but had been one of the people who had leaned in more than most to kind of try to learn the industry, learn what we were doing, and had a specific skill set. So if we didn't go down to 5 or 3 or whatever the number is, but that was helpful because it got us out of that silo thinking and got us a little bit more into kind of that asset-based approach, or what have we been given? Who's here for a reason? And I think this is true for most organizations, certainly true for our organization. But once you start looking at the who is already here, and so there's a person, her name is Shanda. And again, if you're at Kairos, you probably know who that is, or you should
Mhm.
know who that is. But Shanda is one of our longest tenured staff. And Shanda has uh, gifts and skill. Like she was, she's here for a reason. It's so obvious now, right? She wasn't hired to do any of the things she's doing today or think the way, but but she is the kind of person and has the kind of skill that is here and was formed in this process. And so now, as you look back on our timeline and our history, um, yeah, she's here for a reason. And I would say that's true for Tony. That's true for me. That's true for others as well. And so, um, God's given us not only kind of these resources, but these people that we have to pay attention to and have to steward very carefully.
And what we do, yeah, and to not treat them as objects to be used for the fulfillment of the mission, but to recognize they're part of the mission themselves.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things I love, and we had this philosophy at Evangelical Seminar before we joined Kairos, and I found this resonance with it. Finding good people, and perhaps to fill where there's a need, there's something that we need to done, and find somebody to do, but then not define that job so closely. Build it out around the
Yeah.
person. Who is this person that God has given us, and what is it that they're doing, capable of doing? So
Yeah.
position descriptions are largely absent at Kairos. My job description is to do what Tony does, as
Mhm.
as you
Yeah.
say quite often, and that creates some vagueness and maybe some ambiguity that makes it challenging at times. But there's also then this freedom to grow into what it is that.
Yeah. You very clearly. Um, this is fun, Tony. We're all over, but not surprising. When you and I get together like this, it's the two curious people with lots of stories to tell. But yeah, with hiring, it's always, at least today, right? Just you start with the who. And
Yeah.
that's most of the work, right? You're figuring out it's a way of being, what's the type of person that you're looking for. Then you step into, does that person fit our culture, right? Because that's not always true, right? There are people who are great people but we change things because it's Tuesday, right? We move quickly, and so there are people that's not. They might be one. They might be great to be around and be, but they're not going to love being a part of kind of the culture that we've created. So you're discerning that together. And then third, you get to what skills, gifts, capacities do you have? And do they align with any of the needs that we have? And so again, that's way down at the bottom of the list. You're always paying attention to who are the people kind of that you're being introduced to, and eventually you get to yeah, kind of what they might do in your system. And to step that out even just more practically, the way I often go about this is that then you start with a project. You rarely hire somebody on the front. You start with, hey, do you want to do some things with us? Here's a project, because that can allows us to discern together whether they are a good fit for our culture, whether they do have the capacities that they need. And so most of the people that we have hired at Kairos in the last season have come up with those relationships, not a job posting someplace in a process where we picked one of them, where we were kind of looking, identifying, and then giving opportunities to people to see, yeah, to see who's the best fit. But you don't hire somebody until, again, this is more of the stewardship piece, until you absolutely have to. You
Yeah.
start first with, are there other are there other people that God has brought that could do the work on your team already? Are there technology solutions? And by the time you get to the place where we need to hire somebody, it's like, I can't think of any other way to do it. And this person has to be part of our team because, yeah, we can't see any other way forward.
And then seeing a person and not just a resume is a part of it. Most of my most successful hires were people that were not qualified for the job I hired them for by the traditional standards. And but there was a person that you could, if you look closely enough, you can see something in them, and you call that forward. And suddenly
That's
they're end up flipping. Yeah, your experience, you didn't plan on doing all of this, but you do. Shanda's experience, my own experience. I never intended that
yeah,
this would be the work that God would have me do, but
yeah. Surprise, surprise. I gravitate towards Moses, right? As a model of a leader who continually was put in situations that he did not feel prepared for. And so I think that that's true in my story, and certainly others.
wonderful. We're going to have to pull this part of our conversation to a close, unfortunately. I do have another good question, but for those of you who are listening into the recording, we have students discuss live with our guests after we stop the recording, and we do that to protect our privacy. So we can do that. I have another question on the other side, but which I'll give you now in case anyone listening in later wants to explore this on their own. What happens if the whys collide? What if we can't agree on what our why is? And how do you resolve that without just resorting to power? So maybe we can pick that up on the other side, but ponder that if you're out there and are being intrigued, if your curiosity is being kindled a little bit by this conversation about whys. Thanks so much, Nate. And thanks so much for all of you who are listening and imagining together with us on what it is that God is up to in the world.
Yeah, thank you.